gamer used an unqualified power supply. This is what happened to his computer. LC was a 24-year-old teenager. His computer was presenting to the repair room with its system unstable and hard drive broken. LC is a young college graduate. As a gamer, he always wanted his very own high-end gaming rig. 1 week ago, LC finally decided to build his gaming rig with his intern salary. However, the current GPU market is not ideal, to put it mildly. A high-end gaming graphics card can easily blow his budget. But LC has been dreaming about this for years. He couldn't let a simple GPU press to stop him. You see, as a tech newbie, LC didn't know much about computer builds, so he reached out to a computer pre-built seller for some help. The seller told LC he could probably use an integrated graphics card and a low-end power supply for now and upgrade them later. LC took this advice. Few days later, his computer was arrived. Everything was perfect, besides the GPU. LC was pleased at first. After all, he just realized his dream. However, things changed really fast. LC could no longer tolerate the poor performance of his integrated graphics just few days later. Lucky enough, one of his friends told him that he can send an old GPU to LC. But it was a power-hungry GPU with a power consumption of whopping 500 watts. Apparently, the power supply that LC had was not enough. LC asked that friend for some advice. But unfortunately, the power supply that friend recommended to him was too expensive. I'm not gonna buy this. I have to save money for my fancy GPU, he thought. So he tried to find some luck on Taobao. And luck he did find. There are plenty of cheap 500 watts power supply on Taobao. The design looked more or less the same compared to the more expensive ones. Plus, all the reviews are positive. That's a much better bang for the buck. I'm not gonna pay for the stupid brand premium, he thought. LC finally upgraded his power supply and graphics card. The gaming performance was not ideal, but it was significantly better than the integrated graphics. Everything seemed fine. Until one day, LC fired up his PC for gaming. His computer suddenly crashed when the game was in a critical moment. He was pissed off, but there was nothing that he could do. Everything was normal after he restarted his computer. It's just an edge case, he thought. After all the hardware was carefully selected by him. There was no chance of instability. However, the reality told a different story. The crashing becomes more and more common, especially during the gameplay, which is unacceptable for LC. His friend insisted the graphics card was totally fine, so LC asked people in group chats for some help. People in the chats told him that it could be bad memories. As you know, it's a common reason for random crashes. Thus, LC returned the memory, but the seller found this memory were normal. Nonetheless, the seller agreed the return because memories have all kinds of compatibility issues. The stability may vary depending on the system. What works for the seller may crashes on LC's computer. This is totally normal. LC absolutely roasted the seller in the chat for good measure, and he bought 2 new RAM sticks. However, the very same day after the replacement of the RAM, LC's computer shut it down again. And this time, it's different. The reboot couldn't solve any problem. He asked friends in chats again, but neither cleaning up and replugging the memory nor resetting the BIOS solved any problem. It was stuck in the Windows loading screen. With no other choice, LC reached out to customer service. His PC was brought to the LTD store, where we are now. After the arrival, the inspector checked the computer. Everything was totally normal because a replacement requires a restoration of the system, and LC put it back the original power supply. During the troubleshoot, the inspector found that the computer could not boot because of the failure of the hard disk drive. As you know, when Windows is booting up, you need to check all the partition tables on different hard drives to make sure File Explorer can function correctly. During the boot process, the system in the SSD was able to initialize normally. After the installation, Windows finds another hard drive and tries to access the partition info of that hard drive and get no response. And bibbidi-bobbidi, you got a stuck to Windows. But something was wrong. You see, the crashing issue that LC had could not be reproduced in its stress test. When the inspector contacted with LC again, LC finally told the inspector about the budget power supply. You probably have known most desktop power supply looks like a metal box, and the only thing that matters seems to be the power output. But that was simply not the case. There are many things that you need to consider when buying a power supply, including power output, efficiency, noise, power sequencing, ripples, DC voltage regulation, etc. In the case of LC, the main problem was the power output, voltage regulation, and the ripples. Apparently, despite the 500 watts that the power supply claimed, the rated output was only 400 watts, and only 300 watts are available for CPU and GPU. However, even these rated values are not reliable. Therefore, for a system that consumes around 450 watts like what LC has, it was not overpowered, but at least a drop in the bucket. This was exactly what causes crashes during heavy loads. As if for the failure of the hard drive, that was due to the non-standard voltage regulation and ripples. Voltage regulation, as the name suggested, is the regulation of voltage. Most PC components uses a standard 12 volts input. However, due to the technical constraints, the voltage can exceed 12 volts during light loads and be lower than 12 volts during heavy loads. A well-designed standard power supply should be able to keep that voltage change within 5%. That is at most 12.6 volts and at least 11.4 volts. But those random non-standard power supplies can exceed that range. As every single person on this planet knows, the hard drive is different from other components like CPU and GPU. The power used by CPU and GPU is stepped down by secondary step-down circuits. Thus, they are more tolerant to unstable voltages. But the hard drive uses output directly from the power supply. Now imagine your power supply voltage fluctuates with the load of your PC, and the speed of the hard drive spinner also fluctuates. This naturally causes some problems. According to the documentation of some hard drives, ripples that without proper regulation can also cause negative impact to your hard drives. I haven't figured out which parts the hard drive is being damaged and how that works, but there are plenty of evidence showing a strong correlation. Many documentations of consumer hard drives also mentioned ripples. TLDR is, the ripples only causes harm. LC was actually pretty fortunate, because theoretically speaking, there's a chance for even more serious damages, like literally burn the unprotected components. We can find a lot of examples like this on the internet. Or if LC didn't find that problem as timely, it can cause more harm. I once saw a computer newbie who constantly replaced 4 hard drives, 2 motherboards, and 1 memory. He almost built an entire new PC without even considering twice about the poor power supply. In some extreme cases, it may even cause safety risks. In this experiment, we used 80% of the rated power of the unbranded power supply. In a few minutes, we can smell the burning plastic. With thermal cam, we can see the internal temperature has reached more than 100 degrees and is constantly rising. If there's heavy dust, lack of ventilation, or there are flammable stuff in the chassis, it can cause fire, electronic shots, and other threats. Fortunately, LC hasn't gone through any of those cases. Because his hard drive is still under warranty, the only thing that he needs to do is to buy a new power supply. With the help from his family and friends, LC's PC was able to make a full recovery. Thanks for watching. Keep in mind that no matter what, saving on the power supply is never a good idea. Take care of your computer and be well.